Good morning, everybody. The mystery and romance of railroads. I kind of get it, because I'm an old person. Where I grew up, the Burt Gilman was still a railroad, and it was about it came 3 blocks from my house, and I have a very strong recollection that just as I was going to bed and going to sleep, there was a train that would come by, and I'd hear it, and then whoa. So it's really drilled into the gray matter here. And this is a real dramatic event, an exciting, particularly historic engine that Dick is going to tell us about. So, yeah, and his fascination with the history of railroads.
I'll let you cut more.
Excuse me a minute, Dick. I almost forgot. I was going to mention.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. Our official videographer back there, Al, posts his videos on YouTube. So if anybody has a problem with having, in a real public forum like that, go put a bag over your head or something.
Thank you. In case everybody wonders, I do not live, dream, sleep, and everything else railroads. Basically, I love history, always have, and the research has always been part of that history. I'm one of those probably very unusual high school students who actually did not enjoy writing term papers. So it does exist in my blood. But as I say, I'm a historian. So rails are to me an integral part of that history. I might add in before we start that except for a few islands and Greenland, and maybe Iceland, there are railroads in probably every country in the world. And the rails themselves were the reason why the countries grew. The U.S., it's obvious that we added the whole Northwest and West Coast, but Russia, in the late 1800s, already tied Vladivostok to Moscow by railroad. They knew they had to tie the country together. So anytime we talk railroads, we're talking part of the Industrial Revolution that made countries where they are. Okay. I take my title today from Stephen Ambrose's book, Nothing Like It in the World. It is an interesting, easy to read story about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Let me add a little caveat. When I say transcontinental, we're talking about from the Missouri River to San Francisco. By the time that Transcon started, the east itself, east of the Mississippi, was well populated with railroads. The one problem that existed was bridging the Mississippi and, more importantly, bridging the Missouri. Missouri itself was hard to bridge because of its floods. Spring runoff from the mountains could wipe out about any structure they put on. I can personally attest to what the Missouri River looks like at flood stage because my wife and I, Mary and I, were going west on I-70 through Kansas. The water was coming up to the side of the roadway at that point. That was the Missouri River. We're talking interstate. Later that night, I was talking to somebody, and they told me that probably within about 2 to 3 hours of us crossing I-70, they closed it because the river had flooded over. So yes, the Missouri River is a real problem. The two pictures here are on the left is the meeting of the Jupiter and Union Pacific 119. I'm going to use some numbers, but that's me, at Promontory Point in Utah. This was a staged event. Both railroads actually had moved past each other and decided they better do join rather than each going its own route. The second picture is 2019. I like to say I'm in that picture somewhere, but I'm not going to try to point it out. I was lucky enough to attend the 150th celebration of the Golden Spike, as it's called. There were about 100,000 people there, so it was a very small gathering of rail people. Anyway, so let me see, make sure I can get myself going here down. As I say, I'm interested in history, and the first steam engine, not George Stephenson, I'll talk about him in a minute, was by a mining engineer, Welsh mining engineer named Richard Trevithick. In 1804, at the Pennydarren Ironworks in mine, he decided to take a steam pump, convert it to drive a wheel, and run down a set of tracks. The purpose simply was that for 17 miles, the Pennydarren mine had to haul iron ore, and sometimes coal, down to the canal at Abercynon. By the way, Aber in Welsh language means joining of two waterways. So the 17 miles from Method to Tickville to Abercynon was always done by mules or oxen, and they wanted a better way to do it. Unfortunately, the engine ran correctly the first way. It had to be hauled back by oxen. And the next one is, people got together. I don't know that it's going to come out. I think the conversion here did not come out. I was hoping it would. Anyway, that's a recreation of the first steam engine by Trevithick. There was a video on it. Sometimes converting from Windows over to Chrome, things get lost, and here's an example. Anyway, it did work, and showed just how that engine, you can see what the engine looked like. Anyway, that's what it looked like. The difference between this engine and the original one was there were safety features installed. One of which was to keep the boiler from getting overpressured and going boom. The second piece was to add a reversing gear. So at the end of this run, the engineer or driver in English reverses the engine, goes the other way. But I think it was a cute picture, and that's probably what it looked like to people who were there. The steam engine that we probably all recognize, the rocket, was developed by another mining engineer, George Stephenson. And many history books credit him for inventing the steam engine. As they say, 1829 was only 24 years, right, 25 years later. But it was the first working passenger steam engine. And it was exhibited on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. It was a contest, 500 pounds. It had to make 10 runs over 1.5 miles of track, and it reached the top speed of 36 miles per hour. The picture of the rocket there is what's in the National Rail Museum in York, England, and that's my picture. The first U.S. railroad was the Baltimore, Ohio, in 1830, and they wanted to haul coal over the Appalachian Mountains. By 1850, they had more than 9,000 miles of track. And I was going to count up the miles of track by the time the start of the Transcontinental Railroad, but I forgot to do it. Okay, there was always a dream for a transcontinental railroad, bridging the continent at least between the Missouri River and San Francisco. And it became most apparent after gold was discovered in 1848. At that time, a trip cost $1,000 and could take 6 months. There was a hostile climate, the American natives, diseases, and especially cholera. And the sailing trip, while it shortened the time, involved that dangerous passage of the Cape Horn or across the Isthmus of Panama. Yellow fever was always an issue there. But there were minerals, gold and silver, lumber and pelts in abundance that the Northwest had. And you say, why San Francisco? Well, because San Francisco was a working port at the time. And the Northwest still had not shown its ability or shown what they had available. As I said, there was a large network of railroads east of the Missouri. There were four dreamers, I will call them. One was Asa Whitney. He was a merchant, made his millions going back and forth between San Francisco and China, taking pelts and coming back with spices and other Chinese items. Thomas Hart Benton, who is also, there is a painter, Thomas Hart Benton, but this is the original Thomas Hart Benton, wanted something from Missouri, his state, to San Francisco. Theodore Judah was a civil engineer, and he is actually originally connected with the Sacramento Valley Railroad. But his aim was to cross the continent. And finally, the guy on the right, your right, was the proponent of a transcontinental railroad. So he was as important as anybody. Okay. Excuse me. This is a map of the, whoops, go back here. This is a map of the final railroad. It started at Omaha, right there, and ended up over in San Francisco. From here over to about here, is the Platte River Valley. It was a critical part of the decision of the route that they were going to follow. And I'll give it in a minute why. It's on the 42nd parallel, excuse me, and Glenville Dodge, who was a general at the time of the Civil War, convinced Lincoln to use that. It was a great disadvantage that there was no wood past the 100th meridian, and I'll get back in a minute. The parallel routes that were surveyed are shown here, and the top one in pink, excuse me, is the 47th, the 48th parallel, and it now became the Great Northern Railroad route. It was going to open up to the west to the east. The second one in blue was the actual transcontinental railroad that was built. And it connected with a then very active railroad in the east, or on the Midwest, called the Rock Island Railroad. And remember, maybe remember my little sing-along at Rock Island line. The green one was a 38th parallel, and it now became the Denver Rio Grande. It served, again, San Francisco, but a lot of the wealth of the mountains and the Sierras, and also Rockies. The third and fourth, the 35th and the 32nd parallel were over relatively flat country. The 32nd became the Southern Pacific, and the 35th AT&T. The 35th had minerals but too mountainous. 47th was discarded at that time because it was unpopulated. The problem with 32nd, by the way, were hostile tribes, the Cheyenne, the Hopi, and the Navajos in particular. Also, you got to an area that was literally no water or no wood, and wood was important for the steam engines. It also, this was always to me an interesting point about the 32nd, it was resisted by Congress because it would bring slavery to the non-slave owning states. So there was a big debate, and Congress refused to fund anything that would increase the reach of slavery. How the railroad was financed? Basically by personal finance. The big four will be shown on the next slide, and I'll talk about them in a minute. But stocks and bonds, outright loans, now that came about with the Pacific Railway Act of 1863. That was Congress, and that's what really made the rails available, particularly in the West. For the Transcontinental Railroad, they would be paid $16,000 a mile for every to Salt Lake City, $32,000 to Salt Lake to Sierra, and $48,000 to Sacramento. They thought at the time, well, you can build a railroad over the Sierras for $48,000, didn't work. For each 20 miles built, by the way, the money was available. Companies could issue first mortgage bonds, and there were land grants. This is the Land Grant Act, which had 12,800 acres on alternating sides of the roadbed. The right-of-way was included. Many of you probably in your high school history courses remember hearing about the Land Grant Act. That could be sold and included in the railway. Later on, a group called the Crédit Mobilier, and those who heard Lowell's presentation on the rebuilding of Paris, this is where this came from, the Crédit Mobilier. They used that, Pierre Brothers used that to finance that rebuilding. Okay, players on the Central Pacific, and that's what this route was, from San Francisco was called. Theodore Judah, Collis P. Huntington, Mark Hopkins, Leland Stanford, and Curtis Crocker. Some of the names may be familiar. I gave Carl Sandburg's poem, Huntington literally sleep in houses 6 feet long. This was the Huntington. He was a merchant lawyer and later became president of the Southern Pacific. Charles Crocker was built originally a successful forge before moving in Indiana, then moved west. He opened a store and became exceedingly wealthy and joined by other members called Big Four. Leland Stanford is Stanford University. He and his wife Jane actually founded the university. He was a mercantile wholesale businessman and made money there. So it was money that just came out from all. Mark Hopkins was a lawyer and store owner of Placerville and joined Huntington for a mercantile. By the way, Huntington really never stayed in San Francisco. Huntington stayed back east and became the lobbyist for the railroad. So he figured prominently in all of the building of the Central Pacific. On the Union Pacific, we have Thomas Durant. He really was a doctor, graduated from Albany Medical School. However, he knew or figured out how to make money with shortcuts. Not like anybody we know nowadays. And made a lot of it, by the way. None of it very legally done. General Glenville Dodge, he was the chief engineer, and as I said, he gained his fame in the Civil War and worked with Sherman on the march to Atlanta, destroying rails and bridges. Oliver Ames, nice guy, but unfortunately he was open to graft. Then Oakes Ames was his brother. The Ames, by the way, took over the business from their father, and Ames, for anybody that has ever used any gardening implements, probably has used at least an Ames shovel. And so Ames still is making gardening equipment. And I'm not going to try to point this out. The first 23 miles of the Sacramento Valley, which was the original name for it, came starting in San Francisco. And I think I can point at this. Let's see if I get on my seat here. So it was going to start in San Francisco and ultimately work its way up to Maryville in California. It was abandoned because Judah realized that